Avoidants don't chase until the one person who understands them stops chasing. Because when it comes to a super empath, everything feels different. To the avoidant, almost unsettlingly different. Super empaths carry a type of emotional intelligence that can't be imitated or faked. It's not dramatic, it's not demanding, and it's not manipulative. It's intuitive. It's calm. It's the kind of awareness that notices patterns without judgment and sees emotional wounds without trying to fix them. And for an avoidant who has spent their entire life protecting themselves from closeness, that kind of understanding feels both terrifying and magnetic. They can't decode it because it doesn't fit their defense mechanisms. They can't categorize it because it isn't chaotic, and they can't detach from it because it feels like the one thing they never knew they were starving for. Super empaths offer connection in a way that doesn't corner the avoidant or threaten their independence. They give attention without trying to control, and they extend warmth without suffocating the other person. This is rare for the avoidant, who is used to people wanting more from them, more communication, more consistency, more emotional presence than they know how to give. But the super empath doesn't overwhelm them. They don't crowd their space or demand vulnerability. Instead, their presence feels spacious, compassionate, and grounded. It allows the avoidant to exhale in a way they didn't even realize they'd been holding tension. And because it feels so natural and unforced, the avoidant starts letting their guard down without even noticing that it's happening. What the avoidant doesn't fully understand, at least not consciously, is that this emotional safety is exactly what they've craved their entire life. They've run from closeness, not because they didn't want love, but because love always felt like pressure, like expectation, like losing themselves. But with a super empath, love feels different. It feels like possibility instead of threat. It feels like curiosity instead of fear, and it feels like freedom instead of confinement. This shift is subtle at first, but it becomes powerful. It becomes addictive. The avoidant begins to realize that being around the super empath feels easier than being without them. They find themselves thinking about them when nothing is happening, during the silence, during the distance, during the moments when their usual coping mechanism would have been detachment. But now, detachment doesn't feel as satisfying as it used to. The avoidant notices a void when the super empath steps back even slightly. They don't want to admit it, but they feel it. Because when someone finally sees them without overwhelming them, when someone finally understands them without demanding anything, when someone finally makes closeness feel safe rather than dangerous, that is the person they can't walk away from. And that is the moment the avoidant does something unexpected. They begin to chase the one person they thought they would never need. Your calm feels like home to someone who's never had a safe one. Avoidants grow up learning that chaos is normal, not always loud chaos. Sometimes it's the silent kind. Emotional distance, unspoken tension, unpredictable affection, or the constant pressure to be self-sufficient long before they were ready. They learn that relying on anyone is dangerous, that needing someone leads to disappointment, and that closeness comes with a cost they don't want to pay. So they build a life around hyper-independence. They master the art of emotional self-containment. They become experts at pretending they don't need comfort, connection, or stability. But underneath that controlled exterior is a nervous system that has never truly felt safe, never fully relaxed, and never known what it's like to rest in someone's presence without bracing for impact. Then they meet the super empath, and everything shifts. The empath doesn't come with chaos, expectation, or emotional demands. Their presence is steady, grounded, and soothing in a way the avoidant can't logically explain. It doesn't trigger the usual alarms in their mind. Instead, it quiets them. A super empath doesn't push, pull, or pressure. They don't over-explain their feelings, and they don't flood the avoidant with emotional intensity. They create an environment where the avoidant's body, not their mind, starts to feel safe for the first time. It's a feeling the avoidant has no template for, but they recognize it instantly in their bones. This is different. The avoidant can't describe why they feel calmer around the super empath, but they feel the shift every time. Their breathing deepens. Their anxiety softens. Their internal tension loosens. The walls they've spent years perfecting start to lower naturally, not because they're trying to open up, but because the empath's presence makes it unnecessary. The avoidant isn't used to this. They're used to relationships that require defensiveness. They're used to emotional environments where they must protect themselves. But around the super empath, their nervous system gets a message it has never received before. You're safe. And that safety is addictive. It's not the dramatic, fiery intensity the avoidant usually mistakes for connection. It's not the thrill of the chase or the rush of inconsistent affection. It's the quiet kind of connection, the stable kind, the kind that isn't loud or chaotic, but deeply regulating, like soft light after years of darkness. The avoidant doesn't consciously analyze it, but their body responds every time. They find themselves wanting to be around the empath. Without knowing what, they feel more grounded in their presence, more understood without having to speak, more settled without having to explain their internal storms. The super empath soothes them simply by existing. And for someone who has spent their entire life believing they must face everything alone, that kind of emotional regulation feels like a home they never had, but always needed. A home they didn't know they were searching for until they found it and you're calm. You see through them, and that terrifies them. Avoidants spend their entire lives perfecting the art of emotional camouflage. They hide behind silence, distance, logic, independence, anything that keeps people from seeing the soft, wounded parts of them. Their detachment isn't just a habit, it's armor. Armor built over years of disappointment, emotional inconsistency, or being taught early on that vulnerability is unsafe. They move through relationships using predictable patterns. Push when things get too close, pull when they fear losing the connection, retreat when emotions get heavy, return when things feel calm again. Most people fall for the pattern. Most people only see their surface, the aloofness, the independence, the cool exterior. But a super empath, they see everything underneath, instantly, instinctively, effortlessly. Super empaths read emotional patterns like a second language. They don't just listen to what someone says, they hear what someone means. They don't just observe behavior, they recognize the wounds driving it. They understand avoidant fear, avoidant shame, avoidant defensiveness, not because they force themselves to, but because they sense it. And while the avoidant is used to people making them or giving up on them, the empath does neither. They simply see the truth without the avoidant confessing anything, without them expressing their fear of intimacy, their fear of abandonment, or their deep belief that they are better off alone than hurt again. This is where the terror begins. For someone who has survived by hiding their emotional world, being seen so clearly feels like exposure. It feels like being unmasked in a room with bright lights and nowhere to run. The avoidant can sense when the super empath sees past the facade, straight into the insecurity, the longing, the confusion, the internal battles they thought they'd successfully concealed. And that level of visibility feels dangerous. It threatens their control. It threatens their emotional boundaries. It threatens the very identity they've crafted to feel protected. So their instinct is to pull away, to shut down, to distance themselves before the empath gets too close. But here's the paradox. That same visibility is also irresistible. No one else has ever understood the avoidant without explanations. No one else has ever connected the dots so effortlessly. No one else has ever looked at their inconsistency and seen fear instead of indifference. The avoidant may run, but they always feel the pull back toward the person who saw them. Not the version they present, but the version they hide. Because even though being seen feels terrifying, it also feels validating. It feels relieving. It feels like finally being recognized after years of emotional invisibility. The super empath becomes the one person who can't be fooled. The one person who reads the avoidant soul without needing words. The one person who sees the wounded child behind the adult defenses, and no matter how far the avoidant tries to distance themselves, they can't unfeel what it's like to be understood so deeply. Being seen scares them, but being unseen scares them even more. You don't react to their distance. You understand it. Avoidants are used to relationships following a very predictable emotional script. They pull away and the other person panics. They become distant and the other person becomes desperate. They shut down and the other person tries to pull them open. This pattern has reinforced their belief that closeness always comes with pressure, expectations, or emotional intensity. they don't know how to handle. But when the avoidant pulls away from a super empath, something entirely different happens. Something the avoidant is not prepared for. Instead of chaos, there is calm. Instead of panic, there is peace. Instead of chasing, there is understanding. And that response short circuits the avoidant's usual defense system. Most people interpret the avoidance withdrawal as rejection, punishment, or emotional abandonment, but a super empath sees it for what it really is: fear, overwhelm, a nervous system that is trying to regulate itself. The empath doesn't take the distance personally because they understand the avoidant isn't pulling away from them. They're retreating into their internal world because their emotions feel too big, too unfamiliar, or too threatening. So instead of clinging, the super empath gives space. Instead of demanding answers, they offer patience. Instead of feeding the avoidance fear, they soften it simply by not reacting with emotional intensity. This confuses the avoidant in the best and strangest way. Their entire relational blueprint is built on the idea that distance creates conflict, that when they pull back, the other person will push forward. They expect the pattern to repeat because it always has. But the super empath doesn't follow that pattern. They break it, they disrupt it, they respond with emotional steadiness that the avoidant isn't used to and doesn't know how to process. And suddenly, the avoidant finds themselves in unfamiliar territory. Distance no longer gives them power. Instead, it highlights the empath's emotional strength. When the empath remains grounded in the face of withdrawal, it does something powerful to the avoidant. It reduces their fear. It shows them that closeness doesn't always equal pressure. It teaches them slowly and silently that space can exist in a relationship without triggering loss or instability. It makes them feel safer in ways they cannot articulate because they realize the super empath doesn't need reassurance, attention, or constant validation to stay present. The empath simply understands, and that understanding becomes something the avoidant subconsciously gravitates toward. Your calm becomes the emotional equivalent of gravity, steady, grounding, unshakable. The avoidant begins to associate you with safety, not suffocation, with acceptance, not demand, with peace, not pressure. And without meaning to, you become the one person whose presence doesn't overwhelm them and whose absence doesn't punish them. You become the person they can step away from without fear of chaos, and the person they naturally move back toward because your energy doesn't mirror their fear. It softens it, it steadies it. Your emotional stability becomes the magnet they didn't know they needed. Your absence feels louder than their avoidance. Avoidants are used to being the ones who create distance. They're used to being the one who pulls back first, who decides when the emotional temperature gets too warm, who controls the pace of closeness by stepping away when their internal world becomes overwhelmed. Distance is their shield, their reset button, their familiar territory. But when a super empath steps back, something very different happens, something the avoidant is not emotionally prepared for. Because when the empath withdraws, it's not out of fear, insecurity, or neediness, it's out of awareness, out of emotional clarity, out of a quiet understanding that staying present with someone who is consistently unavailable only leads to self-abandonment. And that kind of withdrawal hits the avoidant in a place they don't expect. Most people pull back from avoidance with resentment or confusion, but the super empath steps back with neutrality, with peace, with a calm that communicates, I see what you're doing and I won't chase you. This creates a shockwave inside the avoidant. Their usual pattern, distance followed by being pursued, suddenly breaks. The script they've relied on no longer works. They were expecting panic, frustration, emotional intensity, but instead they are met with silence. A silence that feels more honest, more reflective, and more revealing than any argument ever could. And that is the moment the avoidant starts to feel a longing they never talk about. Because in your absence, they realize something they couldn't see when you were near. You weren't draining them. You were grounding them. You weren't crowding them. You were calming them. You were calming them. You weren't demanding connection. You were offering safety. Your presence wasn't heavy. It was stabilizing. Your energy wasn't overwhelming. It was regulating. They didn't notice the emotional oxygen you provided until they were breathing without it. Avoidants often believe they thrive in silence. They tell themselves they prefer independence, space, solitude, freedom. And to a degree, that's true. But the silence they're used to is the silence of emotional suppression, not the silence of losing someone who brought them peace. When the super empath steps back, the avoidant is confronted with a new kind of quiet, one that doesn't soothe them but exposes them. It reveals how much chaos was inside them all along. It highlights how different their internal world feels without your calming presence anchoring them. Suddenly, the avoidant finds themselves thinking about you in moments when they usually feel detached. They replay your softness, your understanding, your calm. They feel the absence of the person who made their emotional storms less violent. And without meaning to, they begin to miss what they once dismissed. The steadiness you offered, the clarity you brought, the emotional safety they didn't know they relied on. Your absence becomes louder than their avoidance. It echoes in the spaces where their defenses used to protect them. It reveals how much your presence mattered, and for the first time, the avoidant realizes the one thing they've been running from is the very thing they can no longer go without. You don't need them, and that's what pulls them in. Avoidants have a deep-rooted fear of being needed in a way that feels consuming. Dependency, to them, feels like a trap, a slow erosion of their autonomy, identity, and emotional safety. They've spent their whole lives believing that closeness demands sacrifice, that relationships require self-abandonment, and that intimacy inevitably ends with someone taking more than they can give. So when most people show interest, affection, or emotional reliance, the avoidant reacts reflexively. They withdraw, they distance, they detach, not out of coldness, but out of protection. They run from anything that threatens their independence, anything that feels like pressure, anything that smells like emotional expectation. But then they meet the super empath, and everything inside them shifts. The empath doesn't come with neediness. They don't come seeking validation, constant reassurance, or emotional rescuing. They are self-sufficient, emotionally mature, and intrinsically whole. The super empath knows how to stand alone without collapsing and how to care deeply without dissolving. There is no frantic energy, no desperation, no attempts to hold the avoidant together. Instead, there is an internal strength that radiates calm confidence, a strength the avoidant instinctively recognize. And because the empath doesn't need them, the avoidant feels something they rarely experience, safe to come closer. Your independence mirrors theirs, but with one crucial difference. Your independence doesn't come from fear. The avoidance independence is rooted in survival and self-protection. Yours is rooted in self-awareness, emotional clarity, and inner balance. You don't cling because you don't have to. You don't pressure because you trust the connection. You don't smother because you don't confuse love with possession. And this confuses the avoidant at first, because they're used to people wanting something from them, but you simply offer space, connection, and presence without taking anything away. This is where the magnetic pull begins. The avoidant finds themselves drawn to your energy because it doesn't threaten their autonomy. Your calm presence doesn't activate their defenses. Your strength doesn't feel overwhelming. Your emotional maturity doesn't feel demanding. You are the first person they've encountered who can stand beside them without leaning on them, and that makes the avoidant feel like they can finally let someone in without losing themselves. Your independence shows them that closeness doesn't have to mean collapse, that connection doesn't have to mean sacrifice, and that vulnerability doesn't have to mean danger. The avoidant begins to notice that being around you doesn't drain them, it steadies them. They realize they can open up without feeling consumed, that they can share without feeling exposed, and that they can connect without feeling trapped. And in a world where they've always associated relationships with suffocation, where self-sufficiency becomes the very thing that makes you irresistible. Because when you don't need them, they finally feel free enough to want you. You trigger their growth, even when you don't mean to. Avoidants spend years avoiding the very parts of themselves that hurt the most. They dodge emotional intimacy, sidestep vulnerability, and bury the wounds they don't know how to face. Their entire relational pattern is built on selective blindness, ignoring the fears, insecurities, attachment injuries that have shaped them. Most people never challenge this because most people either accept the avoidance distance or fight against it, leaving the avoidant feeling misunderstood or pressured. But a super empath doesn't do either. Instead, without even trying, they become a mirror that reflects the avoidant's emotional truth back to them, clearly, gently, and undeniably. It doesn't happen through confrontation or criticism. Super empaths don't lecture, force insights, or call out flaws with anger. The growth happens through contrast. Your compassion quietly highlights their defensiveness. Your ability to listen without judgment reveals how quickly they shut down. Your emotional openness exposes how deeply they fear being seen. Your willingness to be present shows them how often they disappear. Every time you show up with softness, their walls feel sharper in comparison. Every time you offer understanding, their withdrawal looks more obvious. Every time you extend care, their avoidance becomes something they can no longer pretend is normal. That contrast is uncomfortable for them, deeply uncomfortable. The avoidant begins to recognize the emotional gaps within themselves, not because you pointed them out, but because your behavior makes them impossible to ignore. You are patient where they are rigid. You are warm where they are guarded. You are vulnerable where they are shut down. And you love in a way that reveals just how much they have resisted receiving love. You trigger growth simply by embodying the emotional maturity they've never allowed themselves to develop. This is why they run. Growth feels like danger to an avoidant. It feels like stepping into a version of themselves they've hidden from for years. It feels like exposure, like risk, like losing control. So when the connection gets too intimate or too reflective, they pull back, not because they don't care, but because they care more than they know how to handle. Distance feels safer than transformation. Silence feels easier than honesty. Withdrawal feels more comfortable than facing the parts of themselves you bring to light. But here's the part they never expect. They always come back. Because while growth feels painful, losing you feels worse. Losing the person who loved them without pressure, who saw through them without judging, who understood them without them having to explain. That's a loss they can't shrug off. Your presence changes them. Your absence exposes them. And even if they run, even if they retreat, even if they pretend they don't feel the shift happening inside them, they can't undo the impact you've had. You become the first person who makes them confront what healing could look like and what staying the same will cost them. That is why they return. Not because you chase them, but because growth may scare them, yet losing you terrifies them even more. You love without losing yourself, and that's their weakness. Avoidants are used to people loving them in extremes, either with overwhelming intensity that suffocates them or with detachment that mirrors their own avoidance. They've rarely met someone who can hold deep care and strong boundaries at the same time, but a super empath can. You love with depth, sincerity, softness, yet you never disappear into the relationship. You don't bend yourself into someone you're not. You don't abandon your needs just to keep peace. You don't shrink your truth to avoid conflict. You can hold someone's heart without dropping your own. And that combination is so rare that it disarms the avoidant on a level they don't talk about. Avoidants often expect love to come with emotional sacrifice, someone giving too much, expecting too much, or losing themselves in the connection. But when you show them that love can exist without self-erasure, their entire worldview gets challenged. They're used to people either clinging to them or competing with their independence. You do neither. You stand with them, not on them. You care, but you stay grounded. You love deeply, but you remain whole. And this forces the avoidant to confront something they've long avoided, the possibility of healthy intimacy. Your boundaries are not walls, they're clarity. You know when to give and when to step back. You know when to listen and when to speak truth. You know how to stay emotionally connected without losing your center. This balance creates a dynamic the avoidant isn't prepared for. They can't dominate you emotionally, but they also can't push you away through distance. You're not intimidated by their coldness, nor are you manipulated by their silence. Your stability makes their defensive patterns ineffective. Their usual strategy, pull back, wait for the other person to react, doesn't work on you because you don't respond with panic. You respond with self-respect. This is where the avoidant becomes vulnerable. Your emotional strength exposes their emotional weakness. Your inner stability reveals their inner turmoil. Your ability to love without losing yourself highlights how much they have lost themselves in their own defenses. And while this realization scares them, it also pulls them in closer because you offer what they've secretly wanted: connection that doesn't suffocate, affection that doesn't demand, love that doesn't swallow their identity whole. You become the exception to everything they thought they knew about relationships. You show them that intimacy doesn't have to mean losing independence. You show them that emotional closeness doesn't have to mean emotional chaos. While you show them that two whole people can love without merging into something codependent or destructive. And that truth becomes magnetic. The avoidant finds themselves drawn to you, not because you chase, not because you need them, but because your self-possession creates a type of safety. They've never known you love them, but you love yourself too. And that is something they can't resist, can't replace, and can't forget. You offer what they want without becoming what they fear. They push you away, but you're the only one they feel safe running back to. Avoidants live in cycles: distance, withdrawal, silence, retreat. These are their default strategies for managing fear and overwhelm. They push people away not because they don't care, but because closeness feels threatening. Vulnerability feels dangerous. Emotional intensity feels like a trap. And yet, no matter how many times they retreat, there is always a pullback, a return to the one person who does something they've never experienced before. They offer connection without control. They offer closeness without pressure, love without neediness, and presence without demand. That person, more often than not, is the super empath. Super empaths don't try to control the avoidance cycles. They don't chase when the avoidant withdraws. They don't plead for attention or force engagement. Instead, they create a space that feels emotionally safe, a space where the avoidant can retreat without fear of judgment or consequence. This is unfamiliar territory for someone who has spent years expecting chaos, disappointment, or emotional imbalance whenever they attempt closeness. The avoidant doesn't consciously recognize it at first, but their nervous system senses it. And slowly, subtly, irresistibly, the avoidant begins to associate you with safety, a rare, grounding presence in a world that has never offered them that kind of stability. Because of this, no matter how far they pull away, no matter how many walls they build, the avoidant always returns. They may test the boundaries, they may pretend that distance is freedom. They may even convince themselves that leaving is easier. But your steady presence, your ability to offer connection without smothering, understanding without judgment, and support without dependency becomes the gravitational force they cannot resist. They can't articulate it. They can't always explain it. But their behavior betrays their unconscious longing. You are the emotional safe zone they didn't know they needed. The cycles continue. Push, retreat, return. But each return strengthens their internal recognition of your value. Unlike others, you don't punish their distance. You don't respond with frustration, anger, or coerce. Your calmness, patience, and consistency teach them something they've never been shown. Closeness doesn't have to be dangerous. Vulnerability doesn't have to be risky. And love doesn't have to be overwhelming. This is why they feel drawn back to you again and again. It's not the chase, not the drama. It's the simple truth that in your presence, they feel understood, held, and safe. You become their emotional anchor, the one person who doesn't trigger fear or defensiveness, the one person who makes stepping into intimacy feel possible instead of threatening. And while the avoidant may continue to push and pull, their heart always remembers the one they return to is not just someone who cares, but someone who sees them, understands them, and holds them without compromise. That realization quietly binds them to you in a way that nothing else can. You are the safe place they never expected and the only one they can't stay away from. The avoidant never stays away from the person who makes their walls unnecessary. Avoidants have spent most of their lives building walls, layers of protection designed to keep them safe from emotional overwhelm, disappointment, and intimacy they didn't know how to navigate. These defenses are not arbitrary. They are survival mechanisms, honed over years of inconsistent connection, emotional neglect, or trauma. Pulling back, creating distance, shutting down, These behaviors have become their default mode of coping. They've learned to rely on walls as a form of control in a world that often feels unsafe. And yet, for all their skill at detachment, there is one type of person who disrupts the entire system without ever trying to dismantle it. The super empath. A super empath doesn't push. They don't break down walls with force, confrontation, or manipulation. They don't try to fix the avoidant or draw them out of hiding through pressure. Instead, their presence quietly renders the walls irrelevant. Their calm, grounded energy, unwavering compassion, and consistent understanding make the need for defense fade naturally. The avoidant doesn't feel the walls being chipped away. They simply notice that being around the empath feels safe, effortless, and strangely liberating. They realize they no longer need to guard themselves because this person doesn't threaten, demand, or overwhelm them. Instead, the super empath meets them exactly where they are, without expectation or judgment, and in doing so creates an environment where walls are unnecessary. This is revolutionary for an avoidant, for someone who trusts almost no one, who has spent years fearing intimacy, judgment, and vulnerability. Encountering a person who can hold them safely changes everything. The super empath becomes the exception, a rare presence that demonstrates closeness without danger, connection without suffocation, and love without demand. The avoidant begins to understand, consciously or unconsciously, that they can be fully themselves, completely seen, and still accepted. And that understanding becomes magnetic. Even when the avoidant retreats, even when they attempt to distance, even when they test the connection in familiar patterns of push and pull, their mind and heart remember the safety and ease the super empath provides. They may leave temporarily, but they cannot unfeel the experience of being around someone who makes their defenses unnecessary. No other person compares. No other person offers the same combination of understanding, patience, and emotional stability. They cannot forget, they cannot replace, and they cannot truly stay away. In a world where the avoidant expects disappointment, detachment, or emotional overwhelm, the super empath is the anomaly, the rare presence that proves connection doesn't have to be a threat. And that rarity becomes irresistible. The avoidant doesn't chase, they don't manipulate, they simply return, drawn not by need, but by recognition. Recognition of a presence that changes everything. A presence that makes them feel safe enough to lower their walls without losing themselves, without fear, without risk. The avoidant never stays away from the person who makes their walls unnecessary, because once they experience that kind of love and understanding, nothing else, no distance, no fear, no habit of avoidance can keep them away. You are the exception they will always come back to, the one they can't forget, can't replace, and ultimately can't stay away from.